안녕하십니까. 네, 환영합니다. 인사드리겠습니다. 제19회 김옥길 기념강좌에 참석해 주신 여러분, 선배님, 후배님, 학생들과 교수님들, 이 모든 이대 가족 여러분, 그리고 바쁜 일정에도 불구하고 참석해 주신 국내외 손님 여러분 환영합니다. Special welcome to our guest lecturer, Dr. Ursula Heise. 행사 진행을 맡은 이화여자대학교 국제대학원 초빙 교수 85년 졸업생 손지혜입니다. 저는 안타깝게도 김옥길 총장님 시대의 모교를 다니지는 못했습니다. 그렇지만 이대의 사랑, 자유, 정의를 마음껏 누렸던 한 졸업생으로서 늘 김옥길 총장님에게 깊은 고마움을 느끼고 아직도 교정을 거닐며 특히 아시겠지만 봄꽃이 만발한 이 봄에 교정을 거닐면 우리 큰 스승님의 그 숨길이 아주 곳곳에 깃들어 있는 듯 합니다. 그래서 오늘 이 소중한 기회를 주신 총장님 그리고 이화인문과학원 김진희 원장님 여러 선생님들께 감사를 드리겠습니다. 그럼 오늘 많은 좋은 일들이 벌어지고 있을 거니까 바로 행사에 들어가겠습니다. 먼저 인문과학원 김진희 원장님의 개회사를 듣겠습니다. 원장님.
안녕하십니까. 이화인문과학원 원장 김진희입니다. 이화의 캠퍼스가 생명의 봄빛으로 가득 차 있습니다. 이런 도약의 계절에 평생 이화의 여성교육을 위해 헌신하셨던 김옥길 선생님의 뜻을 기리면서 제19회 김옥길 기념강좌를 기쁜 마음으로 개최합니다. 김옥길 선생님께서 가르쳐 주신 정신과 가치를 되새기며 오늘 이 자리에 함께 해주신 교내외 귀빈 여러분 그리고 학생 여러분들께 깊은 감사를 드립니다. 김옥길 기념 강좌는 2001년부터 개최되어 온 이화의 대표적인 국제학술 강좌입니다. 매번 세계적인 석학을 모시고 동시대의 가장 첨예하고 선진적인 주제를 다루어 왔습니다. 이번 학술 강좌 역시 전 인류가 직면한 기후 환경의 위기에 대응하는 인문학적 통찰과 상상을 담고 있습니다. 오늘날 심각하게 진행되는 환경 오염과 생태계의 파괴, 그리고 기후 변화 등은 전 지구적인 위기 상황을 가져왔습니다. 이런 변화는 자연과 문명, 나아가 우리 삶의 토대가 되는 자본주의적 삶에 대한 우리의 인식을 총체적으로 재검토하라고 요청합니다. 환경 문제를 슬기롭게 해결하기 위해서 우리에게는 과학 기술이나 정책, 제도를 넘어 인문학적 성찰, 즉 삶에 관한 새로운 가치관, 윤리의 재구성, 그리고 기존의 경계를 넘어서는 지적 상상력이 필요한 것입니다. 하이제 교수님의 이번 강연 리얼리즘을 넘어서 내러티브와 환경의 미래들은 문학적 재현과 서사 전략의 차원에서 지속 가능한 사회로 나가기 위해 우리가 어떻게 상상하고 어떻게 소통해야 할 것인가라는 문제의식과 대안을 적극적으로 제시하고 있습니다. 오늘 토론을 맡으신 김혜령, 박지영 두 분 교수님과 사회를 맡으신 손지혜 교수님께서는 하이제 교수님의 메시지와 문제의식을 청중들과 함께 나누기 위해 힘써 주실 것입니다. 지난 몇 년간 이화인문과학원은 김옥길 기념 강좌를 주관해 왔습니다. 매번 행사를 준비하면서 김옥길 선생님께서 추구하셨던 덕목과 가치가 새롭게 해석되어 계승되었으면 하는 소망을 가졌습니다. 이번 기념 강좌 역시 이화의 학생들을 각별히 사랑하셨고 또 진취적인 학술 연구를 선도하셨던 선생님의 뜻을 받들어 젊은이들에게는 특별한 교육과 경험의 기회로 그리고 학술적으로는 글로벌한 이슈가 펼쳐지는 장이 되었으면 합니다. 더 나은 세계와 더 정의로운 미래에 대한 상상을 담은 하이제 교수님의 강연을 통해 김옥길 선생님께서 늘 강조하셨던 공동체와 정의 그리고 함께 살아가는 공생의 가치가 확산되고 지속 가능한 사회적 비전이 강연장 안팎의 사람들과 공유되기 바랍니다. 그리하여 오늘 제19회 김옥길 기념강좌가 이 자리에 계신 많은 분들께 새로운 학술 담론은 물론 희망의 메시지로 기억되기 바랍니다. 감사합니다.
원장님 감사합니다. 지금 말씀해 주신 바대로 정말 인문학적 성찰이 얼마나 우리가 지금 직면하고 있는 이 문제를 해결하는 데의 중요한 건지에 대한 생각을 오늘 한번 다시 할 수 있는 기회며, 또 원장님이 말씀해 주셨듯이 이 문제를 우리가 접근하는 데 있어서 석학들은 이 지도에 나갈 수는 있지만 많은 우리가 직면해 있는, 특히 여기 많이 참석돼 와 계신 학생들의 미래가 굉장히 중요한 이슈이기 때문에 오늘의 강연이 특히 많은 분들이 같이 활발히 토론하고 같이 공유할 수 있는 자리였으면 좋겠습니다. 이어서 우리 김은미 총장님의 환영사가 있겠습니다. 총장님.
안녕하세요. 오늘 살아계셨더라면 102세가 되셨을 이화의 큰 스승 김옥길 선생님을 기념하는 제19회 김옥길 기념강좌를 여러분들을 모시고 직접 열게 되어 감사하고 뜻깊게 생각합니다. 저는 김옥길 선생님이 이화의 제8대 총장님이셨을 때 이화에 입학해서 채플에서 정말 쩌렁쩌렁 울리는 목소리로 설교를 하시던 때가 아직도 눈에 선하고 귀에 선합니다. 유신 시절 학생들이 데모를 하려고 정문 밖으로 나가려고 할 때 오직 학생들을 보호하겠다는 일념으로 나가려거든 먼저 나를 밟고 나가라고 소리치신 일화는 정말 유명합니다. 물론 그런 다음에는 직접 학생들의 선두에 서서 개량 한복 위에 망토를 걸치시고 학생들이 안전하게끔 데모대를 이끌고 정문을 나서셨던 것도 이화의 유명한 전설입니다. 김옥길 선생님의 이화사랑, 학생사랑은 정말 남달랐습니다. 오늘 이 자리에는 이화학당의 장명수 이사장님, 신일영 전 총장님, 또 김혜숙 전 총장님, 이명경 총동창회장님, 김옥길 선생님과 또 오랜 기간 인연을 맺어오신 오뚜기 그룹의 함영준 회장님께서 참석하셨습니다. 김옥길 선생님을 그리워하는 많은 분들과 또 학생들이 오늘 이 자리에 참석했습니다. 여러분 모두를 환영합니다. 김옥길 기념강좌는 이화를 글로벌 여성고등교육의 주체로 우뚝 세우시고 이화와 국가를 항상 생각하셨던 선생님의 공동체와 정의로운 사회 구현에 대한 가치와 실천에 대한 여러 노력들을 기리고자 지정되었습니다. 그동안 이화의 여러 기관들에서 다양한 주제들을 통해 선생님의 가치와 실천의 담론들을 다루어 왔습니다. 이번 제19회 김옥길 기념강좌는 생명과 생태에 대한 공동체의 문제의식으로 기획되었습니다. 오늘 모신 우르술라 하이제 교수님은 미국의 명문대학교 UCLA 영문학과의 마르시아 H. 하워드 문화 석좌 교수님으로 현대문학, 환경문학, 지속가능한 사회, 공상과학 등 정말 다양한 분야에 대한 통섭적, 다학제적 연구와 교육을 하는 세계적인 석학이십니다. 특히 우리 시대의 전지구적 화두인 환경과 기후변화에 대해 문학적 연구와 교육뿐 아니라 실천도 열정적으로 하시는 정말 본받고 싶은 이 시대에 존경하는 지성인이십니다. 오늘 우르술라 교수님은 리얼리즘을 넘어 내러티브와 환경의 미래들이라는 제목으로 기후변화의 위기와 이에 대해서 우리의 인식 변화와 실천의 필요성에 대해서 말씀해 주실 것으로 기대합니다. 선생님의 강연은 이화가 주창하고 있는 창의와 도전, 소통과 혁신, 공감과 포용의 핵심 가치를 통한 지속가능 사회를 선도하는 창의혁신 플랫폼의 비전과도 맞닿아 있습니다. 오늘 진행을 맡아서 수고해 주실 손지혜 교수님, 또 토론을 이끌어 주실 김혜령 교수님과 박지현 교수님, 또 본행사를 정말 정성스럽게 준비해 주신 이화인문과학원의 김진희 원장님과 또 여러 선생님들께 감사를 드립니다. 오늘 참석하신 모든 분들께서 이 굉장히 시의적절하고 흥미로운 주제의 강연에 귀 기울여 주시고, 아까 우리 손지혜 교수님께서도 말씀해 주셨지만 토론에도 정말 적극적으로 참여하셔서 제19회 기목길 기념강좌가 여러분 모두의 행사가 되시기 바랍니다. 감사합니다.
감사합니다, 총장님. 여러 번 강조가 되니까 이제 많은 참석과 많은 참여가 있으실 거라고 믿고 오늘의 메인 이벤트로 넘어가겠습니다. 오늘 강연을 해주실 우슬라 하이제 교수님께서는 캘리포니아대 영문학 전공 교수님이시고 환경서사전략연구소 환경지속가능성연구소 소장이십니다. 자세한 내용은 또 찾아보실 수 있고 지금 총장님께서도 소개시켜 주셨으니까 이 정도로 지금 간략하고 이 교수님의 강연으로 들어가겠습니다. 교수님 강연은 Environmental Beyond Realism, Narrative and Futures. 리얼리즘을 넘어서 내러티브와 환경의 and Environmental Futures, 환경의 미래를. 안내사항을 말씀드리는데 그 앞에 동시 통역기가 있습니다. 지금 교수님께서는 영어로 연설을 해주시니까 동시 통역기를 사용하시면 한국말로 번역된 연설을 들으실 수 있습니다. 나중에 질의응답도 물론 한국말로 영어로 어떤 편한 언어로 질문을 하셔도 좋습니다. 네, 그러면은 하이제 교수님을 모시겠습니다.
Thank you so much for the generous introduction, Dr. Sunjie, and thank you, Dr. President Kim and Director Kim for the invitation. It is a great honor to be here, and also an honor to be able to memorialize a strong woman leader who's really opened up wonderful possibilities for women's education and their role in the contemporary world. This is a particular pleasure since that in the American academic scene has become so rare. I should also add that it is a wonderful pleasure to be on this campus. I had the occasion yesterday to get to know the students a little bit, and they are absolutely stunning in their command of academic theories as well as just their flawless command of English. It's really impressive. The other great pleasure I've experienced in just the short time that I've been here is simply to get to know a campus that I must say is stunningly beautiful, both in its architecture and in its current spring splendor. So it's just in every way an overwhelming honor and pleasure to be here with you and to be able to share some of my ideas about how we imagine environmental futures. But also then I really look forward to the conversation with colleagues here about how we should think about these issues from the vantage of different disciplines. So let me begin here. Do I have the remote for the? I think the remote is. Okay, wonderful. Thank you. So I want to begin with the well-known American writer and activist Bill McKibben. He's the author of dozens of nonfiction books about the environment and a founder of the influential organizations 350.org and Third Act. He published a book 10 years ago with an odd-looking title, Earth. It looked like a typo, and nobody quite knew how to pronounce this. Earth, like the normal word earth, Earth with the vowel drawn out or longer than normal, earth, earth, or some other pronunciation. So nobody knew. And the book's subtitle, Making a Life on a Tough New Planet, made it sound like a survival guide for astronauts. Now, McKibben himself explains the title in the first few pages. The world hasn't ended, he says, but the world as we know it has, even if we don't quite know it yet. We imagine we still live on that old planet, that the disturbances we see around us are the old random and freakish kind. But they're not. It's a different place, a different planet. It needs a new name. Earth, however you pronounce that. It still looks familiar enough. We're still the third rock out from the sun, still 3/4 water. Gravity still pertains. We're still Earth-like. But it's odd enough to constantly remind us how profoundly we've altered the only place we've ever known. So McKibben here uses the conceptual vocabulary of science fiction to jolt his readers out of the routine assumptions about the natural world and its future development. Looking at our home planet as if it were an alien one, reading it as if it came out of a science fiction novel, he implies, will help us figure out how we need to adapt to global ecological change. It's a bit of an odd beginning for a book that is otherwise completely immersed in sober portrayals of ecological change and the challenges it will bring, is already bringing, for normal economic and political functioning. Lots of science here, very little fiction. But the facts are meant to drive home the sense that the new realities are driving out old realisms, old ways of thinking about and representing the planet to ourselves. McKibben is far from alone in adopting this narrative strategy. Other writers and filmmakers, in fact, have used it far more explicitly and extensively. The Age of Stupid, a 2009 documentary film by the director Franny Armstrong, begins and ends with a science fiction scenario set in 2055, when an aged man, whom you see here, played by Pete Postlethwaite, when an aged man asks why we didn't stop climate change when we had the chance to. The rest of the film is straight-up documentary about climate change and the resistance to the energy transition. James Hansen's book of popular science, Storms of My Grandchildren, The Truth About the Coming Climate Catastrophe and Our Last Chance to Save Humanity, also from 2009, includes in the explanations and predictions of an extremely well-known climate scientist a science fiction chapter. And in that chapter, aliens visit our world in the future, a few hundred years in the future, and lament what a mess we humans have made of it. The journalist Jeff Goodell begins and ends his nonfiction account of climate change and the flooded cities it will lead to. The Water Will Come, Rising Seas, Sinking Cities, and the Remaking of the Civilized World from 2017, with science fiction evocations of a 2038 hurricane in Miami and generally cities underwater in the future. The historians Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway go even farther. They published a well-known nonfiction book called Merchants of Doubt in 2010, which was a book about climate change denialists. And they followed it up with a science fiction novella in 2014 called The Collapse of Western Civilization, A View from the Future. It's not exactly what you would call a great work of literature. The narrator is a Chinese historian in the year 2393, but he sounds exactly like a disgruntled American climate scientist in 2023, somebody who's angry that people aren't listening to him. And even though the book rejects technological fixes, the climate crisis is ultimately resolved by a genetically engineered mushroom that can absorb CO2. So much for plausibility and consistency. But the novella was hailed by the media as a great idea, a way of making climate change come alive to non-scientific readers. Neither is climate change the only environmental crisis that has provoked movements back and forth between the prose of scientific realism to more speculative genres and back. Alan Weisman explored human impacts on the planet in his 2007 book, The World Without Us, by asking what would happen to urban, agricultural, industrial, and wild areas if humans suddenly disappeared from one day to the next. Another science fiction premise, the sort of last man or no man left. And more generally, the concept of the Anthropocene is based on the idea of geologists in the far future, possibly alien ones, who will examine Earth's geological strata and find evidence of the age of humans. This conceit starts the groundbreaking book, The Earth After Us, What Legacy Will Humans Leave in the Rocks, from 2008, by the British geologist Jan Zalasiewicz. So this is the beginning of that book. The expedition team, picking their way through the boulders at the foot of that mighty ravine, knew, even as they first glimpsed the rock layer, that this might be what they were looking for. They had, of course, been seeking in such proof, but this surpassed their expectations and promised to resolve the tantalizing scraps of evidence that had perplexed and divided scientists for so long, ever since exploration of the planet's past had begun. There could now be no doubt. There had lived here many millions of years ago an ancient civilization, and one that could colonize on a grand scale. The stratum extended as far as their vision carried in the cliffs above. The explorers took samples from above and below that remarkable stratum, but the more experienced of them were convinced already of its deeper significance. It was at the same geological level as the traces of the ancient, catastrophic environmental change that had over years of their researches emerged as an ever clearer part of this planet's geological record. So it goes on for a little bit more. I've shortened it here. And then Zalasiewicz goes on to say in his first chapter, the purest of science fiction, the Earth in a post-human future many millions of years hence being re-explored. So again, you have a science fiction premise of future geologists looking back. And Donna Haraway recurs to science fiction explicitly and at length in her book, Staying with the Trouble, Making Kin with the Cthulhu Scene from 2016, which is a critical academic engagement with the Anthropocene concept. But it includes a series of futuristic short narratives, the so-called Camille stories. In these stories, the human population has shrunk drastically, a topic that is central to Haraway's argument, but oddly only discussed in footnotes in the main text. Instead, humans take on specific and targeted responsibility for particular non-human species, such as butterflies or birds, to the point of mixing genes with them. These are just a few examples. There are many more. It's a striking development in environmental nonfiction and popular science about the environment over the last 20 years that quite frequently themes, plots, and narrative strategies from science fiction have been adopted as a way of taking on the realities of environmental change. So why is that? Why would a genre of writing whose primary purpose is to communicate scientific insights to the public, propose policies, and incentivize people to take action, resort to a genre that seems so patently non-realist, a genre associated with aliens, space travel, and fantastic technology? The first step toward answering this question would be to say that this is not a new strategy in environmental writing. Rachel Carson stated her book, Silent Spring, from 1962, a book about the harmful impacts of pesticides on humans and the environment that is often credited with starting the modern environmental movement, with a fable for tomorrow. This is a brief science fiction tale of about 3 pages, and it portrayed the transition of an idyllic farming village into a lifeless, blighted landscape. The rest of the book is fairly sober popular science. The science fiction story, though, is what most readers remember most vividly, and it's also one of the aspects of the book that earned Carson bitter reproaches for exaggeration and inaccuracy, and female hysteria, too, by the way. To hit back, Monsanto magazine published a science fiction story in the same style that describes crops destroyed by bugs, farmers impoverished, and widespread famine. So that was their way of saying this is completely inaccurate and it's just a woman's exaggeration. Paul Ehrlich, in his 1968 book, The Population Bomb, used science fiction even more consistently. He inserted fictional vignettes between his popular scientific chapters to illustrate what statistical trends in population growth would translate to in the lives of ordinary people. He, too, was fiercely attacked for the inaccuracy of these short stories and began to think that they actually distracted from his main arguments. So he asked the publisher to omit them in later editions of the book. Still, both of these books were extremely popular and shaped emergent environmental movements in North America, but also many other parts of the world. This may be one of the reasons that contemporary environmental writers are going back to narrative strategies borrowed from speculative fiction to develop vivid portraits of environmental futures, mostly pessimistic ones. And yet, it remains strange that they would adopt these strategies in spite of the fact that the speculative elements so often get into the way of realist books and films that otherwise ask for a rational, fact-based, and scientific reception. So I'll turn away from environmental journalists, activists, and scientists for a little while to writers of science fiction to explore a different avenue into this problem of realism. That is, that in order to convey a realistic conception of the state of nature, authors recur to types of narrative that are not normally perceived as realist. But before I go to speculative fiction, let me briefly talk about the problem of realism in relation to environmentalist thought so as to set a broader framework for the discussion. Questions of realism have entered environmental debates mainly in two ways. One, the question of the relationship between environmentalism and natural science, and two, the question of environmental communication and what type of representation is best suited to convey the seriousness of environmental crises to the public and to political establishments that have often shown themselves rather less concerned than experts about them. Environmentalism as a mode of thought and as political engagement is rooted in the natural sciences. Without the authority of biology, ecology, geology, chemistry, atmospheric and oceanic sciences, environmentalist claims would have no foundation. It doesn't matter whether the central topic is pollution or species loss. At bottom, any discourse on these issues has to base itself on science. But as all of you know, environmentalism has also from its beginnings included important strains of thought that see science as part of the problem rather than the solution. In this perspective, Western science has historically contributed in a major way to a conception of humans as separate from nature and to the instrumentalization of nature that has created a vast range of contemporary crises in the first place. So philosophically, environmentalist thought has been split in its commitment to scientific realism. Pragmatically, too, natural science and the kind of realism it adopts have proven a less than solid ground for the environmental social sciences and humanities. As the environmental historian Richard White once put it, historians thought ecology was the rock upon which they could build environmental history. It turned out to be a swamp. By this he meant that quite a few environmental historians, literary critics, and philosophers assumed that ecological science would provide them with a solid basis for sustainability in terms of value judgments and the assessment of social structures and cultural practices. But instead, they found that there is no straightforward connection between the study of ecosystems and particular cultural values or aesthetic forms. This became a particular point of debate, but far from the only one, when concepts such as harmony, equilibrium, or balance as designations of value were supposed to derive directly from science. Another challenge arose with the emergence of the environmental justice movement from the 1980s onwards, especially the emphasis on recognition justice in addition to distributive justice that started in the early 2000s. Recognition justice included the acknowledgement that natural science is not the only system of knowledge to manage nature, and that other epistemological systems, for example, indigenous ones, also needed to be recognized. One prominent example is the management of ecosystems through controlled burns, which was practiced by Aboriginal Australians and Native Americans for millennia before the arrival of Europeans. The validity of this kind of management for the involved ecosystems was recognized and has been integrated into Australian and American forestry. But other elements of indigenous knowledge are proving harder to integrate. Beliefs in supernatural powers that inhere in nature, for example, or to give a more specific example, assertions by some Inuit communities that polar bears are not currently at risk. How does one combine respect for alternative knowledge systems with contradictions to scientific insights? This has become a subtle but persistent challenge to scientific realism. I'll leave aside here the quite unsubtle and overt challenges to scientific realism that have arisen through the denial of climate science and also, of course, the denial of the coronavirus more recently. These have been dealt with extensively by historians such as Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway, and by literary scholars such as Greg Gerard and Axel Goodbody, as well as, of course, by the scientific community itself. But the controversies over realism in relation to environmental issues did not limit themselves to science. They also arose in debates over how such issues should be publicly represented and communicated. The question of how common narrative forms can engage with environmental processes and crises today, especially planet-wide and hard-to-perceive changes like biodiversity loss or global warming, has generated lots of debate among writers, filmmakers, anthropologists, historians, literary critics, and philosophers over the last decade and a half. Unsurprisingly, climate change has occupied a central position in these debates and has in fact often come to function as a proxy for other environmental crises, whether they're causally related to climate change or not. But the debate over realist presentation and the environment dates back further than that. When environmentally oriented literary and cultural studies emerged in the 1990s, they were fiercely opposed at first to the constructivist strains of theory that were then still dominant in these disciplines. They were also very invested in the genre of nonfiction nature writing, which sometimes does and sometimes doesn't overlap with scientific nonfiction, as well as in documentary films, all eminently realist genres. And fictional narrative, as well as poetry, were frequently read realistically. That is, as engagements with real-life environmental crises. At the time, that was an important set of moves. Nature writing had not been a focus of literary study before, and realism pushed against the constructivist grain that was popular in academia at the time. But even within the field, doubts about the privileging of realism soon emerged. Scott Slovic, in brilliant readings of 20th century nature writers, showed how some of them do indeed present realistic portraits of the natural world, whereas others slant their presentations of facts and observations of nature in such a way that they become derealized. He picked interesting examples from a Pulitzer Prize-winning book called Pilgrim at Tinker Creek by Annie Dillard. Another literary critic, Dana Phillips, in the early 2000s openly questioned whether realist modes of narration were really best suited for environmental purposes, and whether environmentally oriented researchers shouldn't pay more attention to surreal, supernatural, self-referential, or other derealizing strategies that might open up access to a different understanding of nature and humans' place in it. The enormous broadening of the kinds of works that eco-critics looked at past the turn of the millennium, with far more comparativist research on different regions of the world, deeper historical analysis, and studies across media, help to reinforce the point that what is realist in one context or medium isn't necessarily so in another. Animist views of non-human species and even of inanimate landscapes are perfectly standard components of a realist worldview in many historical and indigenous cultures. Media such as film and montage techniques that are a normal part of perfectly realist films today seemed surreal and needed to be explained to audiences back in the 1930s. And so on. A crucial insight that later narratologists like James Fallon and Peter Rabinowitz put the emphasis on is that realism is realist within the framework of particular cultural communities, not necessarily outside them or across cultural divides. So with that as a broad framework in mind, let's take a look at how contemporary science fiction writers approach this question of realism. The future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed yet. This statement by the novelist William Gibson, one of the leading members of the cyberpunk movement in the 1980s, and actually the coiner of the concept of cyberspace, has become justly famous, and it's quoted all the time. So I'm not the only one interested in it. It postulates that what were visions of a technologically saturated future for science fiction writers in the 19th and early 20th century have become present-day realities for many citizens of the world today. say the fact that each of us is carrying around at least one computer in our pockets and backpacks, many of us 3 or 4, that has many times the processing capacity of the computers aboard any of the Apollo missions to the moon in the 1960s and 70s. But Gibson also highlights in this statement what has come to be called the digital divide, the fact that these techno-futures are not available to everyone. Socioeconomic justice has a long way to go in making them so, with the yet here implying that the hope that it will. There's also a different way of reading Gibson's statement, though probably, admittedly, not the one that he intended. The future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed yet, could also refer to the apocalyptic and dystopian visions that have populated science fiction over the last 2 centuries. Waste, pollution, biodiversity loss, and climate change have created social and environmental disaster realities that are at present being disproportionately experienced by communities in the global south and by poor communities in the north. But that will eventually affect wealthier and wider populations as well, if not to the same extent. Gibson, it's fairly certain, didn't have that in mind when he made the statement in an interview in the 1990s, but reading it that way highlights the more pessimistic strands in narratives about the future. Either way, Gibson's remark makes science fiction, or speculative fiction, if you prefer that term as a broader genre category, central to the temporal dislocations that many writers, filmmakers, philosophers, and journalists have commented upon, starting with something like Alvin Toffler's Future Shock from the 1970s. So this is the idea that fundamental changes in technology, economy, culture, and politics have happened over so short a period of time that individuals feel that their own present has come to resemble what was once imagined as a future, either in terms of techno-utopianism or in terms of a dystopian surveillance society. At the same time, a significant number of people, especially younger ones in the global north and south, have expressed a deep fear that their own future is being taken away or restricted significantly, whether it's Greta Thunberg from Sweden or Elizabeth Wanjiru-Watuti from Kenya. Some positive, but especially negative anticipations of the future in science fiction now seem to describe the present, especially but not only under the impact of climate change. And some of you, allow me an aside, will remember that actually during the COVID pandemic and after the election of President Trump in the United States, some bookstores put out a sign that said, apocalyptic fiction has now moved to nonfiction. It was sort of a little political joke on the current situation. So some positive, but especially negative anticipations of the future in science fiction now seem to describe the present especially, but not only under the impact of climate change. Another American science fiction writer, Kim Stanley Robinson, has therefore put it more bluntly. Science fiction is the realism of our time, he has said repeatedly. For example, in an interview with the British newspaper The Guardian in 2015. I think I do science fiction because I feel like if you're going to write realism about our time, science fiction is simply the best genre to do it in. This is because we're living in a big science fiction novel now that we all co-write together. You write your domestic realism and you've trapped yourself into a tiny little portion of a much larger reality. You write science fiction and you're actually writing about the reality that we're truly in, and that's what novels ought to do. So Robinson here associates realism in the contemporary era with a particular scale, the scale of a globalized economy, geopolitics, and planetary ecological crises. This is the scale at which the most important issues of our time should be considered if the goal is realism, he suggests. This problem of scale has come up a lot in discussions about environmental communication and environmental storytelling over the last decade. Writers, journalists, and activists, as well as researchers on environment and narrative, have expressed concern that the most commonly used story templates can't really measure up to problems with the scales of time, space, and the distributed agency of billions of humans that climate change involves. The distinguished Indian novelist Amitav Ghosh expressed this worry most memorably in a book of essays called The Great Derangement, Climate Change and the Unthinkable. Gauche claims that the realist mainstream novel, in the form that arose in Europe in the 18th century and has come to dominate the literary scene worldwide, is incapable of dealing with climate change. Unlike pre-modern epic, he argues, the modern novel is structured so as to separate human culture and out from non-human processes and forms of agency. Those are relegated to the natural sciences. The novel is concerned with everyday people and ordinary affairs, not improbable and extraordinary events. And it is keyed to the scale of the individual, the family, and the nation, not the planet as a whole. In combination, these dimensions disable the mainstream novel from engaging with the Anthropocene. He laments that the novel finds it difficult to engage with collectives rather than individuals today, and argues that the longue durée is not the territory of the novel. Many other voices have echoed these concerns, though sometimes slanting them a bit differently. Adam Trexler, for example, sees the main problem in how narrative can link the scale of the individual to that of the planet. Timothy Clark locates the problem less in what storytelling is possible and more in what stories broad audiences prefer. Other scholars, and I would include myself here, have argued that these concerns are really misguided. Thousands of essays, magazine articles, short stories, novels, graphic novels, nonfiction books, documentary films, and feature films have by now been created that have managed to solve these narrative problems in one way or another. Some of these are realist, some are not. Even the traditional realism of 19th and 20th century novels, in addition, has always sought in some way to put the portrayal of individuals and families into larger contexts, for example, of the nation. And especially in the second half of the 20th and in the 21st century, novelists have developed many ways to connect different scales of space, time, agency, and community. Some researchers call this worlding the novel or planetary realism. So it seems questionable whether the concern over scale is really as well-founded as Gauche, Trexler, and Clark make it sound. All the more so since the novel encompasses far more than the mainstream bourgeois novel that Gauche is exclusively focused on. Genres such as fantasy, horror, or speculative fiction, genres that Gauche totally dismisses, have never really had problems with non-human forms of agency, with the probability or improbability of events, or large scales of space and time. So take science fiction. For at least 150 years, this genre has often featured non-human agents, from robots to aliens and artificial intelligences. It has routinely focused on extraordinary events, such as the discovery of new planets, encounters with aliens, and revolutionary technological change. Neither is scale in and of itself a problem for a genre whose settings include entire planets, solar systems, even galaxies. Indeed, given these ingredients of the genre, one way of describing science fiction is as a continuation of the epic tradition, a very old narrative tradition that does not remain within the limits of what we now consider realism. And one might also respond to Clark's concern about readerly interest in non-human and large-scale narratives by noting that science fiction has had a large popular audience, even though, or perhaps because, it often integrates these elements. So one way of reading Gibson's sense that the future is here, or Robinson's that we are collectively living inside a science fiction novel, would be to say that, well, science fiction is one of the genres that already has the basic tools for portraying global environmental change, including large scales of narrative time and space, and human as well as non-human agents. That would make it natural that it offers itself as a perceptive lens on our present, not just for writers of fiction, but also for journalists and other writers of nonfiction, as well as activists who are seeking to communicate about environmental crises. But I think that sounds plausible, but it is actually a somewhat superficial understanding of speculative fiction. So let me dig a little bit deeper on what the functions of this kind of fiction have typically been. So why do science fiction novels typically locate themselves in an imagined future? The Marxist literary critic Frederick Jameson explained this narrative maneuver, which is one of the basic ingredients of the genre, like this in an essay that has since become a classic. The most characteristic science fiction does not seriously attempt to imagine the real future of our social system. Rather, its multiple mock futures serve the quite different function of transforming our own present into the determinate past of something yet to come. It is this present moment, and now comes a long, typically Jameson spaghetti sentence, it is this present moment unavailable to us for contemplation in its own right, because the sheer quantitative immensity of objects and individual lives it comprises is untotalizable and hence unimaginable, and also because it is occluded by the density of our private fantasies, as well as of the proliferating stereotypes of a media culture that penetrates every remote zone of our existence. So it is this present moment that, upon our return from the imaginary constructs of science fiction, is offered to us in the form of some future world's remote past, as if posthumous and as though collectively remembered. SF thus enacts and enables a structurally unique method for apprehending the present as history. So in other words, what he's saying here is that the narrative construction of a future that forces us to look at our own present as past creates a unique cognitive distance that makes then possible critical political positions. For a politically oriented scholar like Jameson, as well as for any environmental activist, this critical dimension of futurist narrative is crucial. And I think it is why a climate scientist like James Hansen writes a chapter in which future aliens lament the havoc that humans have wreaked on their planet. He doesn't really suggest that this is likely to happen. That's not his purpose. But he uses the imaginary alien perspective as a way of looking at our human ways of life in a different way. It's an estrangement or distancing strategy, in other words. But this distancing strategy doesn't quite work in the same way for narratives whose futures are very close to and similar to the present. That's the kind of story that William Gibson tells in most of his novels, a decade or two into the future, typically no more than that. This is why he inverts Jameson's formula and invites us to look at the present not as a past, but as a future, a present in which important elements of what used to be envisioned as possible futures have already materialized. This is where his approach would converge with Robinson's. Because the future has folded into the present, narratives about such futures have now become simple realism. But that raises two questions. One, if Jameson is right and speculative fiction derives its crucial critical power from confronting its audiences with imagined futures, what becomes of that critical function when present and future are portrayed as more or less identical? And two, there do continue to be lots of narratives, fictional and non-fictional, realist and non-realist, that do seek to explore futures not just as metaphors for the present, but as alternatives for change. How do those fit in? And this is where I'd like to propose a different approach to the question of environmental futures and realist narrative. Jameson's approach, I would argue, works for certain types of descriptions of the future, but it works by evacuating the futures of speculative fiction of genuine futurity and understanding them simply as commentaries on the present. Gibson's and Robinson's approaches, different as they might seem at first, end up in a similar place by questioning the fictionality of speculative fiction and reducing it to one or another version of realism, understood as a commentary on a future that has already arrived. That falls short of what some of the most interesting contemporary narratives about the future accomplish, including, I think, several of Robinson's own. What these fictions do is introduce a central new element that changes the basic structures of society. It's what the theorist Darko Suvin called the novum, many decades ago, back in 1979, which he defined as a central characteristic of science fiction. This innovative element is sometimes realist, like the invention of a new technology by humans, but sometimes it's not, like the arrival of aliens, which then turns into an allegory of social and political change. And those of you who are old enough may remember, like me, may remember speculative fictions from the era of the Cold War, where the arrival of aliens forces the US and the USSR to work together. Not typically fictions that are interested in the possibility of alien life on other planets in and of itself, but these were fictions that wanted to imagine a world in which such collaboration opens up new political landscapes, right, beyond the division of the globe into two blocks. Let me briefly discuss three examples of such narratives, not the Cold War narratives, but narratives that that invent a novum so as to open up different visions of the future. So one is fictional and non-realist. One is an example of a novel that is by most standards fictional and realist, and one is a non-fiction account. All three are concerned with the question of the connection between current environmental crises and social justice. Let me introduce this by coming back to Robinson's conceit that I quoted earlier. If you're going to write realism about our time, science fiction is simply the best genre to do it in. This is because we're living in a big science fiction novel now that we all co-write together. The fact that Robinson here resorts to a rather daring metaphor, we're living in a big science fiction novel now, at the very moment when he talks about realism, already indicates that there's something strange about this way of conceiving of realism. One could ask Robinson here, perhaps in a somewhat predictable way, are you sure about that? Whom do you mean by we? It sounds as if you're talking about the entire human population of planet Earth. Are you saying that all humans have the same degree of agency in shaping the science fiction novel we're writing? Or more literally, in shaping the future? Surely that isn't so in reality. And environmental justice movements, including initiatives and activism for energy justice, climate justice, and multi-species justice, to name just a few, have reshaped environmentalist thinking over the last 30 years precisely to move away from generalizations about the human that are still fairly common in some kinds of nature writing and in the natural sciences. Instead, these movements seek to consider which humans most contribute to the causes of environmental crises and which suffer the most dire consequences. Speculative novelists have taken on this question, and they've done so in both realist and non-realist registers. Nigerian-American writer Nnedi Okorafor's novel Lagoon from 2014 approaches questions of environment and justice through some of the least realist motifs of speculative fiction. The novel is set in Lagos and starts by portraying the impact of oil pollution on the local ocean via the viewpoint of a swordfish. The plot then focuses on the transformative impact of aliens that land there, leading to a new future in which Nigeria will abolish oil drilling, currently its major extractive industry, and will convert to other technologies. It will revive agriculture, and it will end corruption. Okorafor splits the focalization of many of her chapters between multiple characters, with very fast switches between scenes in terms of whose eyes we see through, as a way of portraying the diversity of Lagos as a metropolis. The language is similarly diverse, with frequent switches between Standard English, Pidgin English, and bits of Igbo, Hausa, and Yoruba, Nigeria's major languages. Into this lively mix, the aliens arrive. We don't know what planet they come from, only that they're shapeshifters, and that they've deliberately chosen Lagos as a place that they think will be good for them. This seems to repeat a common motif in science fiction, where the invasion of aliens often mirrors processes of colonization. But the alien who first makes contact with humans called herself Ayodele and has the visual appearance of an African woman. Later, when hundreds of other aliens emerge from the lagoon, they have the shape of Africans, with a few Asians and one Caucasian thrown in. So in a major speech to Lagosians, Ayodele then announces that they have not come to colonize. So it gradually becomes clear that Okorafor takes up the metaphor of aliens as colonizers only to invert it and turn her plot into an allegory of the recolonization of Africa by Africans. These three elements emerge as crucial to the economic and political change that the novel forecasts. So on one hand, you have technology and an energy of change from without, that is allegorized by the aliens. You have change propelled by Africans' own knowledge, skills, and power, which need to be better recognized and used. And thirdly, from the connection with nature and other species. One of the major human characters, Adora, is a marine biologist, and her knowledge of the natural world plays a major role in the plot. In addition, a few parts of the novel are actually focalized through animals, a swordfish, as I've already mentioned, and also a tarantula and a bat. So we see Lagos through their eyes too, which puts the animals on something like an equal footing with the human characters, and the aliens hint that they're not just talking to humans after their arrival on Earth. Now, just how all this will add up to the sweeping economic, ecological, and political change that the novel envisions is not completely clear, since the novel portrays the process of change by way of allegory, not just the arrival of aliens in and of itself, but also the fact that the alien Ayodele, in an act of self-sacrifice at the end, dissolves into a haze that is inhaled by all the people of Lagos, and that changes them. So clearly an allegory for a cultural and ideological change that goes beyond just the abolition of extractive industries. Okorafor's novel is by any standard far less realist than any of Robinson's most recent works, in that it draws extensively on the supernatural, including spacefaring aliens, comic hero superpowers, and elements of African folklore, such as storytelling spiders. The whole story turns out to have been told by a spider at the end. The author's aim here is clearly to signal that is the reappropriation and re-Africanization of European and North American traditions of knowledge and narrative, in combination with a revival of African epistemological traditions that will bring about change. A concluding epilogue takes readers to Chicago, where African-American teenagers who are avid readers of graphic novels hear the news from Nigeria and comment that, of course, Africa would be the place where such things happen. Obviously, an assumption that the futuristic modes of speculative fiction have always been a part of African cultural tradition, even if they've come under other names. And of course, there's a good deal of humor in these scenes. So Lagoon is a novel that transposes science fiction to the global South and uses it as a medium for exploring global ecological change, mixing it with allegory, myth, and folklore in such a way that it moves quite far away from realism. Robinson himself also seeks to portray environmental futures that are in significant ways improved from the present day, though he does so with a detailed interest in natural science and in economic and legislative mechanisms and how they might bring about change. Two of his major novels from the last 5 years, New York 2140 and The Ministry for the Future, engage the question of how capitalist economies might adapt to or be threatened by climate change. In New York 2140, climate change precipitates an economic crisis that's modeled on the one in 2008. Banks and large corporations are once again in trouble around the world and appeal to governments for help. Governments do agree to help, as they did in 2008 and 9, but this time under the condition that each of the companies turn over 51% of their stock to the respective government. So in effect, a socialization of private enterprise that Robinson, who used to be a Marxist, it's no longer quite, but he at least portrays that as a first step in the right direction. In The Ministry for the Future, part of the plot revolves around the introduction of a global carbon currency. And this gets a little bit nerdy. I apologize for the long quote, but it is kind of an important part of the novel. The majority of CO2 was being drawn down by reforestation, biochar, agroforestry, kelp bed, and other seaweed growth, regenerative agriculture, reduced and improved ranching, direct CO2 capture from the air, and so on. All of these efforts were paid for, or rather rewarded beyond the expense of doing them, in carbon coins. And these coins were trading strongly with all the other currencies in currency exchanges. In fact, it looked like there was a possibility that carbon coin might soon supersede the US dollar as the world's hegemonic currency, the ultimate guarantor of value. The US was a big backer of this complementary currency, of course, which was no doubt a factor in its success. And in some senses, the carbon coins were like dollars created by the sequestering of carbon. This made for a kind of double standard, or rather, something finally to replace the lost gold standard. They now had a carbon standard and also the dollar to use for exchanges. But the carboni, as more and more people called it, was also complementing the euro, the renminbi, and all the rest of the fiat currencies that had underwritten the new one. So Robinson here outlines the creation of a mechanism that turns extractivist capitalism inside out, in a sense. Not an outright abolition of capitalism, but a restructuring of its most basic valuation system. He does not present that as the one and only solution. The novel brings up a lot of other factors that lead to change, from eco-terrorism to ecological restoration initiatives, all the way to the work of a ministry for the future under UN auspices. And there is not one agent of change, but many. One entire chapter of the novel consists of a list of different organizations and initiatives from around the world that help to create new social structures and restore ecosystem functioning. But in Ministry for the Future, as in New York 2140, Robinson has tried to reimagine capitalism. Another way to put this would be to say that the speculative fiction seeks to move beyond what has come to be called capitalist realism. This term, as I'm sure you know, was coined by the philosopher Mark Fisher in 2009 and refers to the inability in many sectors of world society to imagine an economic order other than capitalism. Environmentalists have adopted different versions of this strand of thought. The sociologist Jason Moore has argued that current environmental crises, especially but not only climate change, cannot be solved without overcoming capitalism. The Canadian journalist and writer Naomi Klein has argued the same point in her nonfiction book, This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus the Climate, from 2014. But she, too, falls back in the end on a variant of capitalist realism. Several of the models she selects of what a better future should look like are drawn from countries such as Denmark and Germany, which flatters me because I'm originally from Germany, but they're still capitalist countries for all of our aspirations to go beyond. And she opens her book, interestingly, with a quotation from a Kim Stanley Robinson interview. So in that epigraph, Robinson says, "In my books, I've imagined people salting the Gulf Stream, damming the glaciers sliding off the Greenland ice cap, pumping ocean water into the dry basins of the Sahara and Asia to create salt seas, pumping melted ice from Antarctica north to provide fresh water, genetically engineering bacteria to sequester more carbon in the roots of trees, raising Florida 30 feet to get it back above water, and hardest of all, comprehensively changing capitalism." So Robinson's speculative fiction seeks to move precisely beyond capitalist realism through its imaginary futures, as does, in a non-realist vein, Okorafor's Lagoon. Now, not all of the nonfiction writers I mentioned at the beginning who resort to the strategies and themes of speculative fiction when they write about environmental futures share Klein's and Moore's belief that capitalism is the greatest obstacle, though quite a few of them do. But what does hold true for all of them is that speculative fiction opens up for them a register of thinking and writing beyond the current social, economic, and ecological order. So in the end, I disagree with Gibson that the future is already here. The future is still the future, and it may look very different indeed from anything that we currently anticipate. Neither do I find Robinson's reiterated claim that science fiction is the realism of our time all that helpful. It seems to me that, on the contrary, it is where speculative fiction goes beyond realism that it offers the most useful tools for thinking about socially and environmentally just futures. And that may be one of the reasons that it has proven so attractive for creators of environmental nonfiction and documentary film. Though pursuing this does require science fiction to move beyond its current emphasis on deteriorating futures and getting back to imagining better worlds. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was a fascinating speech. 굉장히 흥미롭고 깊은 생각과 고찰을 유도하는 강의였습니다. 저는 특히 교수님이 그 공상과학, 이제 우리나라로 보니까 공상 사이언스 픽션이 우리나라 말로는 이렇게 정확히 없더라고요. 그러니까 그래서 이 공상과학이라는 것이 어떻게 보면 영어로 하면 imaginary science fiction이라고 돼 있어요. 그래서 이거에 대한 관찰, 특히 이제 비과학적인 독자들에게 기후 변화와 같은 과학적인 주제를 생생하게 만들어 준다는 전제로부터 교수님의 연구의 중요성을 깨닫게 됐고, 또 커뮤니케이션을 업으로 하는 저에게는 특히 와닿는 측면이 많았습니다. 그리고 내러티브, 저한테는 이제 스토리텔링이라고 하는 그런 측면이죠. 그래서 저한테는 그 용어가 더 익숙하지만 그 내포되는 의미를 좀 생각하게 되고, 나이지리아 소설에 대한 것도 굉장히 흥미롭고, 로빈슨 소설의 전제와 내포된 의미도 흥미로웠습니다. 우리나라에서의 그 앞으로의 또 소설의 가능성도 좀 생각을 하게 되었고, 특히 이 추측성 소설, 그러니까 speculative fiction이 어떤 세상을 그리게 될까, 또 어떤 미래가 우리를 기다리고 있을까, 또 역시 우리 존재에 대한 생각도 하게 되었습니다. 이런 많은 그 문제들을 우리가 이제 토론하기 위해서 우리 교수님 두 분을 모시게 되었습니다. 환경공학과의 박지영 교수님, 그리고 인문과학원의 김혜령 교수님을 무대로 모시겠습니다. 교수님 두 분 감사합니다. 네, 하이제 교수님의 그 강의를 들으면서 사실은 과학자의 눈에서는 이 공상과학 소설이라는 것이 어떻게 비춰질까라는 생각을 많이 궁금하게 했습니다. 과학자의 눈에서는 정말 구름 잡는 소리를 하는 게 아닌가라는 소설을 보면서 그런 것 같지 않을까라는 생각을 하게 됐는데, 박 교수님께 먼저 한번 토의와 그다음에 질문을 좀 여쭤보겠습니다. 정말 과학자의 눈에서, 환경과학자의 눈에서 볼 때는 지금 내러티브에 대한 공상과학, 스페큘레이티브 픽션에 대한 생각을 어떻게 가지셨는지 궁금합니다. 박 교수님 부탁합니다.
네. 네, 안녕하세요. 그 환경공학과 박지형입니다. 먼저 이 비사실주의적 환경 내러티브의 가능성에 대해서 흥미로운 강의를 해주신 그 하이제 교수님께 감사드립니다. 오늘 강연을 통해 레이첼 카슨부터 킴 스탠리 로빈슨까지 이 비사실주의적 환경 내러티브의 다양성 그리고 중요성을 잘 파악할 수 있었습니다. 저는 생태계의 탄소순환 그리고 온실기체 배출을 연구하는 이제 환경 생태학자로서 특히 기후변화 문제에 많은 관심을 가지고 있습니다. 최근 들어서는 과학적 지식만으로 현재 기후위기 해결하는 게 한계가 있다는 생각을 자주 합니다. 기후위기가 구조적 차원의 문제이므로 이 문제의 복잡성과 그리고 대안을 대중과 공유하기 위해서는 효과적인 환경 커뮤니케이션이 필요한 것 같습니다. 먼저 개인적으로 인상 깊었던 교수님의 통찰에 대해서 한번 말씀을 드리고요. 그리고 환경 연구자의 입장에서 비사실주의적 환경 내러티브의 가능성 그리고 한계에 대해서 질문을 드리고자 합니다. 교수님, 제가 이거 슬라이드를
예, 역시 과학자.
교수님은 과학과 환경주의의 관계가 단순하지 않다고 지적하셨습니다. 생태학이 알고 보니 늪이었다는 이 환경사가 리처드 화이트의 말이 그런 복잡성을 잘 드러내는 것 같습니다. 현실 자체가 사실 복잡하고 그에 대한 해석도 문화적이나 정치적인 요인에 의해 영향을 받을 수밖에 없습니다. 예를 들면 기후변화는 과학적 현상이지만 기후변화를 부인하는 이 그림에 나오는 것처럼 이런 회의론자들은 동일한 현실을 전혀 다르게 이렇게 해석을 합니다. 이런 관점에서 필요에 따라 과학적 사실주의와 환경주의를 넘어서는 비전통적 환경 내러티브가 필요하다는 교수님의 의견에 공감합니다. 소개해 주신 여러 사례 중에서 마지막에 자세하게 좀 안내를 해주신 로빈슨의 소설이 특히 흥미로웠습니다. 교수님은 그 로빈슨식의 SF가 우리 자신의 현재를 과거로 보게 하는 일종의 이제 거리두기 전략을 통해서 독특한 인지적 거리를 만들어내 비판적인 정치적 입장을 가능하게 만든다라고 평가하셨습니다. 데카르트도 이제 비슷한 의미를 가진 말을 했습니다. 뭐 친숙한 자기 땅과 시대를 벗어남으로써 관습과 편견의 어리석음을 깨닫게 해준다는 면에서 여행과 역사 공부는 유사하다라고 이렇게 얘기를 했는데요. 여행과 역사가 각각 현재의 공간과 그리고 과거의 시간에 대한 거리두기라면 로빈슨식의 SF는 시간 여행자가 현재에 대한 시간적 거리두기를 통해서 현재의 모순을 인식하고 대안을 상상하게 할 수 있다는 이 교수님의 통찰이 제게는 특히 인상적이었습니다. 질문 이제 비사실주의적 재현의 한계에 대해서 질문을 드리고자 합니다. 교수님은 결론에서 SF는 악화 중인 세계를 강조하는 최근 경향을 넘어서 더 나은 세계를 상상하는 것으로 되돌아가야 한다라고 강조를 하셨습니다. 사실주의를 넘어서는 내러티브가 더 나은 세계를 상상하는 데 기여할 수 있다는 교수님의 주장에 동의합니다. 그런데 기후위기처럼 긴급한 해결을 요구하고 또 교수님이 지적하신 것처럼 누구에게 책임이 있고 또 누가 더 피해를 입는지에 대해서 이 과학적인 원인 분석하고 대안 제시가 필요한 경우에도 비사실주의, 내러티브가 사실주의적 접근법보다 더 효과적일 수 있다라고 생각하시는지 궁금합니다. 강연에서 소개하신 과학사가 그 오레스케스의 사례로 질문에 대해서 부연 설명을 드리고자 합니다. 오레스케스는 앞서 강연에서 들으신 것처럼 2014년 과학소설에서 제가 또 안 넘겼네요. 네. 제가 안 보여서 이쪽에 있네요. 여기 제일 왼쪽에 아까 교수님께서 보여주셨던 그 과학소설에서 이제 기후위기가 서구 문명을 붕괴시키는 이런 미래 세계의 모습을 통해 기후위기의 심각성에 대해서 경고를 했습니다. 올해 초에는 이 오레스케스가 다른 기후 과학자들하고 함께 석유 기업 엑손모빌 고발하는 논문을 과학저널 사이언스지에 발표를 했습니다. 잘 아시다시피 이 기업은 1970년대부터 이미 이제 이 문제에 대해서 지구 온난화가 심해질 걸 잘 알았으면서 또 다른 한편에서는 뭐 탄소 중립과 같은 어떤 기업의 긍정적인 이미지를 부각하는 그런 또 홍보를 많이 진행을 했습니다. 작년 가디언의 한 기사는 엑손을 포함하는 대형 석유 기업들이 겉으로는 이제 말씀드린 것처럼 탄소 중립에 동참한다고 하면서 이 몰래 신규 프로젝트를 계획하고 있다고 폭로를 했습니다. 이제 과학자들은 파리 협정의 1.5도씨 이 온난화 제한 목표를 달성하기 위해서 인류가 앞으로 배출해도 되는 이산화탄소의 양이 500기가톤을 넘으면 안 된다라고 이렇게 추정을 하고 있습니다. 근데 석유 기업의 신규 프로젝트를 통해서 이보다 훨씬 더 많은 이산화탄소가 배출되면 이제 가디언의 기사 제목처럼 말 그대로 탄소 폭탄이 터지게 됩니다. 이 파리 협정 목표 달성처럼 문제 해결이 시급한 경우에는 앞서 그 오레스케스의 과학 소설보다는 석유 기업이 초래하는 위험에 대한 사실적 분석이 문제의 본질을 파악하는데 더 효과적인 게 아닐까 이런 생각이 들기도 합니다. 이 점에 대한 교수님의 의견이 궁금합니다. 이게 제 첫 번째 질문이고요. 사회자님 그러면 두 번째 질문도 연달아서. 네. 시급한 그 환경 문제 해결에 대한 앞 질문에 이어서 실천에 대한 질문을 두 번째 질문으로서 이렇게 드리고자 합니다. 대중이 일반적으로 SF를 즐기는 방식은 상품 소비의 측면이 강합니다. 그래서 이제 현실의 문제 인식에 더 나아가 문제 해결을 위한 실천 방안을 모색하는 게 쉽지 않을 수 있습니다. 뭐 기생충을 만든 봉준호 감독의 설국 열차 혹시 그 하이제 교수님께서도 보셨는지 모르겠습니다. 근데 이 영화는 기후 위기를 해결하기 위한 기후 공학 해법이 잘못돼서 도래하게 된 미래의 디스토피아를 그리고 있습니다. 아마 많이들 보셔서 그 내용은 잘 아시리라 생각됩니다. 근데 이 영화는 기후 위기를 해결하기 위한 이런 문제 자체보다는 그 이후에 재미난 이제 스토리텔링에 초점이 두어지는데요. 현실과 괴리된 가상의 시공간에서 이루어지는 일종의 폐쇄적인 이런 스토리 속에서 관객이 먼 미래의 이야기를 즐기는 것을 넘어서서 영화 속에 이제 일종의 알레고리로 그려진 현실 문제의 원인과 해결책을 생각하는 게 쉽지 않을 수도 있을 것 같습니다. 그래서 또 로빈슨 미래부에 대해서 자세히 말씀을 해주셨는데요. 기후 재난과 대응책들이 매우 생생하게 묘사돼서 독자를 일종의 가상 현실이지만 몰입시킵니다. 그런데 그 가상의 세계에 몰입된 독자가 미래부가 제안하는 탄소 화폐와 같은 그런 혁신적인 안 보여서 여기 그 동전 이제 탄소 화폐로 최근에 소설 이후에도 많이 이렇게 논쟁이 되고 있는 그런 대상인데요. 돈이 지배하는 이제 이런 냉엄한 자본주의 현실 속에서 독자가 이 나의 정치적 실천을 통해서 어떤 실현 가능한 방안으로서 받아들일 수 있을까? 그런 거에 대해서는 좀 불확실하다라는 생각이 듭니다. 로빈슨의 SF에서 그려지는 것과 같은 대안적 미래를 처음 접하게 된 독자가 더 나은 세계를 상상하는 데 그치지 않고 내러티브가 구상하는 가상 공간을 벗어나서 적극적으로 현실의 모순을 극복하기 위한 실천에 동참할 수 있다고 생각하시는지 궁금하고요. 환경 문제를 해결하기 위한 행동을 이끌 수 있는 어떤 비사실주의적 환경 내러티브 전략이 있다면 거기에 대한 교수님의 의견이 궁금합니다. 좀 질문이 장황했던 것 같은데요. 여기서 질문을 마치도록 하겠습니다. 감사합니다.
네, 감사합니다, 교수님. 지금 그냥 굉장히 과학자스럽게 말씀을 다 논리적으로 해주셨는데 그냥 제가 간단히 이해한다면은 첫 번째는 말하자면 여러 가지 환경 문제에 있어서는 아무리 그래도 원인과 이 결과가 명확한 팩트가 있는데 그런 어떤 리얼리스틱한 애널리시스가 없이 이게 이제 해결이 될까 하는 그런 좀 약간의 의문을 가지시고, 두 번째 있어서는 지금 스노우피어서 같은 그런 정말 우리가 보면은 스토리에 막 빠지게 되는데 과연 그 빠진 시청자가 그 스토리를 넘어서서 그 스토리에 가지고 있는 의미를 내가 그거를 내포하고 또한 나아가서 내가 직접 이 현재를 바꾸는 행동으로까지 이어갈까라는 것에 대한 생각을 궁금증이 가지고 계시는 것 같습니다. 네, 그래서 교수님 어떻게 생각하세요? 굉장히 어려운 질문을 두 개를 던지셨는데.
Thank you, Professor Park, for this incredibly thoughtful and detailed response. And you raise very complicated questions, and I have no idea whether I'm going to be able to answer them to your satisfaction, but let me try. I think you're of course absolutely right that the facts are fundamental. The facts about climate change and scientific insights about what is already currently happening with the atmosphere and what will happen in the future are clearly crucial to all of this. We completely agree on that. I think where the problems arise is in terms of how you best communicate these facts to the public and what kind of reaction you expect. And so I would want to answer your really challenging question in terms of sort of two bodies of research that I think bear on that. One is research on science communication, specifically climate change communication. The other one is the study of risk perceptions. And so I think what emerges from both of these bodies of research, risk analysis going back to the 1960s, science communication studies to the 1980s at least, so far as I'm aware, is a number of things that complicate the assumption that by simply relaying facts to an audience, these facts will be accepted, let alone that they need to change. And I should say right from the start also that communications researchers in both of these fields would want to distinguish between three different kinds of impacts. So one would be when readers of these facts, or people who listen to a scientific lecture on the topic, or people who watch a film about climate change, come out of it, are their attitudes changed, their values, their beliefs, their perceptions. So that will be one kind of change. Another question then is whether that possible change in attitude translates into changes in behavior. For example, does somebody who watches a documentary about the waste crisis start to recycle? Does somebody who watches a documentary about the energy transition go and buy an electric or hydrogen vehicle, right? So that will be a further step, not just that their perception has changed, but that it translates into behavior. And then the third step, which is yet again, I think, quite different, is does that lead them to, I think, what you were talking about, which is does it lead them to political activism, to support for policies concerning climate change. So I think those are three different kinds of impact, and I think we have a fair amount of evidence that both fiction and nonfiction, realist and non-realist stories about climate change or other environmental crises do change attitudes and beliefs. There's a good amount of evidence for that. The evidence also shows that these changes do tend to be temporary. That is, you ask readers or viewers right after they see the film or they listen to the lecture, has their attitude changed? And they will report that, yes, it has. But you ask them again 3 or 6 months later, and that effect will have vanished, which maybe is a reason that we need more stories, and also stories for different audiences. Let me also so that's just very general. Let me maybe respond in a more specific way by saying that what the research in these two areas has shown is that relaying facts alone will not propel change. Why not? Well, because we know that whether the authority that tells the story is trusted makes a huge difference. That is, whether the story comes from somebody whom the audience trusts, and we had great examples of that during COVID, where governments who commanded the trust of their populations in terms of the scientific information about COVID that they relayed had much better success than countries where the population right from the get-go didn't trust their government and was used to their government lying to them. So right from the start, that's an important aspect. And in the United States, whether a particular story comes from the left or from the right crucially influences whether certain audiences will accept what is presented as fact, whether it's factual or not, right? Another thing that the research on science and climate change communication has found is that what you select from the facts and how you present them makes a crucial difference. So just saying, so there's different kinds of climate change denialism, right? There are some people who simply don't believe that it's happening. That's a shrinking number. But there are a lot of people in the United States and elsewhere who still believe that, yes, climate change is happening, but it doesn't have anything to do with human agency. So emphasizing the causes of climate change and really giving them fairly simple mechanistic explanations and metaphors, such as that of the heat-trapping blanket around the globe, have proven more successful than just saying, oh, these are the facts of climate change and this is how it's going to get worse. So establishing long causal chains and then taking them to where the audience can also envision itself being part of the solution, right? So what the psychologists call efficacy, that is that you perceive yourself as having some kind of role in a possible solution to the problem. However illusory that might be in reality, but having that sense will engage people more. And then there's a lot of other factors that also influence how these stories are taken up. So emotion is actually a crucial factor. whether these stories are associated with negative or with positive emotions makes a crucial difference. So they've done experiments with different versions of stories where one version will seek to inspire fear and another version of the story will emphasize worry. And I hope this translates well into Korean. So worry is something like you worry about it, but you're not scared to death of it, right? And it turned out that the worry stories actually were much more effective at getting people to think actively about how they might become involved than the fear stories. So that's, a pretty crucial argument against apocalyptic and disaster stories of the kind that we see so often, including Snowpiercer, which is an apocalyptic story too, although we should actually talk more about it. I think it's an interesting film, but I'm not sure that it's actually mainly concerned with climate change. The research on climate change communication has also found that giving people some kind of hope gets them more engaged than if they're just made to feel that things are going to get worse. Now you could say, okay, what's the point of giving them hope if things really are pretty bad? But it is nevertheless, if we want to prevent even worse outcomes, it has been shown that the positive emotions that come with hope for the future do incentivize people more. And so I would say that all of these considerations, of course, don't necessarily lead you to literature, let alone to science fiction. These are all considerations that also are valid for journalism, for popular science, for any scientist who speaks to the general public, right? So that's not specific to literature. But what literature sort of, I think, allows, and what these visions of the future allow, is to, in some sense, detach ourselves from the emotions and the trust patterns and so forth that we as audiences are usually caught in, and to say, okay, well, this is not our world, this is a future world. So you have that critical distance, and that's kind of what I think is a specific asset in science fiction. But by no means am I suggesting that science fiction is the only medium and that the other media are not equally powerful. But so I think there is a special, so I would completely agree that realist modes of presentation are valuable. I think there is a special value to some of these, some non-realist presentations that actually do base themselves on the science to show us things that we don't conceive of as realist in normal times. Like we just 2 weeks ago had a tornado in East Los Angeles. If you had put that in a novel, I would have said that's not very plausible at all. But it has happened, right? So there are parts of science that actually don't fit into our normal conception of realism in ordinary life, right? So that's sort of what I would answer to this question of realism. But you brought up another question, which is that of urgency, that change is urgently needed. And I think that's a very difficult problem, because urgency, the scientific emphasis on, and the environmental activists' emphasis on urgency is often in conflict with democratic processes that tend to be very slow and very contentious. And that's even true of Rachel Carson. I mean, she published her book in 1962. DDT was outlawed in the United States in 1973. 11 years later. So it took quite some time, even after this appeal and after the mobilization. And so I honestly don't know what the answer to that is, but I worry about the rhetoric of urgency in terms of, like some Americans will sometimes say, oh, I wish we were China, we could just impose change. It's not, obviously that's a naive vision of what's going on in China to begin with, but really, that's what we're advocating for? Authoritarian imposition? No, I don't think so. So I don't know. I struggle with that problem, that the short time frames that we're looking at now, 5 or 10 years, in which we really have to make very crucial changes in our energy infrastructure, that militates against sort of the patient and slow work of democracy, where you have to gain majorities for this. But there too, I think it's interesting that, somebody like Kim Stanley Robinson got invited to the COP26 in Glasgow, as a science fiction writer, because a lot of people way beyond the normal audience for science fiction found the many ideas that he put on the table worth discussing and thinking about. So he clearly captured something that went way beyond, people who are interested in literature usually. So I think there is a possibility for precisely for these more fictional and more non-realist modes to actually jolt people into some of the faster action that is needed. But that's a bit hypothetical. I mean, I don't think we have research right now that would substantiate that, although there is a lot of research now going on, so I'm looking forward to seeing the results of that. So these are some, no doubt, very unsatisfactory answers. As for Snowpiercer, I actually loved that film, but I do think it's more a film about class conflict than climate change in the end, since, climate change appears at the beginning and at the end it's the framework, but I don't think the film actually engages with climate change and its problems. It seems to be mostly about what happens aboard that train, which is fascinating, right? I was actually interested also in his more recent film about the big pig-like creature, genetically engineered creature, and it's subtle but insistent polemic against meat consumption, which might be a more indirect comment on climate change too. Okra, right? Okra.
Thank you. 지금 말씀하신 정말 소설이 가지고 있는 장점에 대한 얘기를 정말 흥미롭고 정말 동감하면서 들으면서도 소설이 가지고 있는 장점이 분명히 있지만 또 위급함이나 정말 우리가 닥친 이 위급한 문제를 소설로서의 얼마만큼의 행동 액션으로 빨리 할 수 있을까 하는 거는 사실 우리한테 준 큰 과제인 것 같긴 했습니다. 이 시점에 우리 과제를 오늘과 또 여러분의 미래로 안고 있는 우리 방청객들한테 한번 질문의 기회를 한번 드려볼까 하는데요. 한번 여태까지 하이제 교수님, 박 교수님의 얘기를 들으면서 이것이 좀 궁금하구나, 아니면 좀 이건 불만이다, 뭐 하는 쪽에 우리 총장님을 비롯한 많은 분들한테 제가 이 얼굴 표정을 보니까 굉장히 동감도 하고 아니다라고 생각하시는 분들이 많이 있는 것 같은데 의견을 제시할 수 있는 기회를 드리겠습니다. 손을 들으시면 마이크가 아마 전달이 될 거고 소속 말씀을 좀 해주시고 한국말이든 영어든 그 말씀을 의견과 질문을 해주시면 좋을 것 같습니다. 혹시 네, 여기 이쪽 중간에 네. 항상 먼저 드시는 게 유리합니다.
안녕하세요. 저는 포스트 휴머니즘 인문학 협동과정에서 석사과정 공부하고 있는 박수려라고 합니다. 네, 먼저 강연 듣게 되어서 너무 감동을 받고 또 저희 연구 주제랑도 관련이 깊어서 특히 더 인상 깊고 재미있게 들었던 것 같습니다. 이제 저의 질문은, 저는 이제 포스트 휴머니즘에 대해서 공부를 하고 또 이제 이런 환경 문제나 비인간 존재들에 대한 많은 관심을 가지고 있는데 항상 마주하게 되는 약간 고민 한계 같은 것이 어떤 인간 행위자로서, 인간의 언어로서 이 비인간의 문제, 환경 이슈에 대해서 사유를 한다는 것에 대해서 한계를 느낄 때가 있어요. 이러한 상황에서 어떻게 우리가 구체적인 변화를 만들고 또 새로운 세계를 상상하기 위해서 이 인간적인 한계를 넘어서서 할 수 있는 연구자로서의 역할이 어떤 게 있을까 하이제 교수님께 여쭤보고 싶고요. 그리고 한 가지 더 여쭤보고 싶은 것이 이제 환경서사 전략연구소에서 지금 소장님으로 계신다고 소개가 되었는데 어떤 역할들을, 어떤 구체적인 프로젝트들을 하고 계신지 궁금합니다.
질문을 하나만 더 받고 하이제 교수님한테 답을 좀 구할까 합니다. 혹시 다른 분이 네. 네.
안녕하세요. 저도 포스트
네.
휴먼
조금 이따 또 기회가 있습니다. 제가 먼저 말씀하세요.
안녕하세요. 저도 포스트 휴먼 융합 인문학 협동 과정에 재학 중인 학생이고요. 저도 강연 잘 들었고, 저는 박지영 교수님의 두 번째 질문에 대해서 약간 다른 의견을 한번 구하고 싶은데, 어차피 관객은 스토리텔링을 즐길 때 문제 해결을 위해서 애초에 접근하지는 않잖아요. 막 이 문제 해결하기 위해서 이 영화를 봐야겠다 이렇게 접근하진 않고, 또 꼭 환경 문제가 아니더라도 스토리가 현재를 바꾸는 행동을 하는 건 직접적이지 않고 항상 우회적으로 이루어져 왔고 스토리는 그렇게 작동해 왔는데, 그러면은 사변 소설을 어떤 비판을 할 때 이런 즉각성이나 실현 가능성을 묻기보단 다른 요소를 조금 물어야지 비판이 더 가능하지 않을까라는 생각을 박지원 교수님께도 질문을 드리고 싶고, 그다음에 하이제 교수님께도 좀 전략적 낙관주의로서 다른 비판, 시급한 문제 해결 말고 다른 우회로로서 작용할 수 있는 비판의 가능성을 조금 질문하고 싶습니다.
이거는 먼저 박 교수님께 제가 한번 그 답변의 기회를 먼저 드리고 하이제 교수님한테 넘어가면 어떨까 합니다.
네, 아주 좋은 그렇지만 어려운 질문 감사드리고요. 저도 이제 개인적으로 아까 그 하이제 교수님께서 인간이 어떻게 그 사실을 이해하는 것뿐만 아니라 행동을 위해서 이렇게 감정적으로 이렇게 영향을 받고 그런 커뮤니케이션 연구자들 말씀하신 것을 보고 듣고 굉장히 이렇게 조금 건조하게 세상을 살고 있는 과학자로서 뭔가 좀 세상 인식이 좀 부족했다 이런 인식을 하고 있었던 차였습니다. 그래서 질문하신 거에서 근데 제가 한 가지 조금 실천을 위해서 우리가 문학 작품이나 뭐 봉준호의 설국열차를 보는 거는 아니지만 이 대상으로 삼고 있는 이 문제 자체가 우리에게 어떤 인식의 전환을 요구할 수밖에 없는, 굉장히 그래서 그 뭐 설국열차를 그런 목적으로 보지는 않더라도 그걸 만드는 행위 그리고 관람하는 행위가 일종의 목적 지향적인 활동이 아닐까 이런 생각을 하고 있습니다. 그래서 그럴 수밖에 없는 게 이게 나의 생존 그리고 같이 살아가는 다른 사람들과 생명체들의 영향을 주는 일이기 때문에 그런 조그만 어떤 그 예술 활동을 향유하는 일도 상당히 어떤 목적 지향적인 관점에서는 자유로울 수 없다. 그래서 물론 그 예술 작품에 어떤 향유하는 다양한 그런 관점이 존재하고 또 그렇게 해서 즐길 수 있지만 한편으로는 이런 문제에 대해서 어떻게 조금 아까 그 교수님 말씀하신 그런 그 정서적인 차원에서 접근할 수 있는지, 그래서 어떤 컬렉티브 액션을 얘기를 하셨는데 그런 컬렉티브 액션을 유도할 수 있을지 그런 점도 조금 SF 형식이라도 고려가 되면 어떨까 하는 그런 순수한 마음에서 질문을 드렸습니다. 그런데 질문하신 분의 그 의견 그 생각하신 거에는 충분한 답변이 됐는지는 모르겠습니다.
네, 감사합니다. 교수님. 이제 갑자기 저 질문 드려서 죄송합니다. 근데 그 저도 동감은 하는 게 지금 아까 하이제 교수님이었지만 이런 SF 그 이런 영화나 소설이 사실은 양적으로 훨씬 더 많아야지만 우리가 그런 목적적인 그런 거 아니더라도 우리 주변에 너무 많기 때문에 가는 데마다 뭐 보인다. 그러면은 확실히 덜하지만 사실 소수이기 때문에 그런 측면이 좀 있지 않을까라는 생각도 했습니다. 하이제 교수님, 나머지 질문들은 하이제 교수님 건데 질문을 한번 질문이 거의 3개로 좀 돼 있는 것 같아. 한번 답변을 해주시면 어떨까요?
So I think this is actually a super interesting question. Thank you for asking it about non-human forms of agency and how they might be represented in narrative. I think that was originally one of the reasons that I became really interested in certain types of speculative and fantastic literature because there are authors in those genres who have precisely experimented with these, with the possibility of seeing the world from the perspective of non-human animals, in some cases of plants, and then more rarely even from the point of view of inanimate substances. So there's a really interesting novel by the Japanese-American novelist Karente Yamashita called Through the Arc of the Rainforest. That has a non-human and technically an inanimate narrator. It's a ball of a substance that is found in the Brazilian rainforest under the soil, and that turns out to be a sort of transformed version of global trash, especially non-biodegradable trash. And the narrator of the story is actually one little chunk of that substance. So that is about as strange and non-human a narrator as you can have. And there are various dimensions to that narrative experiment, but one of them is that this ball actually becomes, in some sense, the voice of the earth as it has been transformed by humans. So that's one of those rare examples where you have actually a narrator who should technically be inanimate. In a lot of other works of speculative fiction, you do have just the view of animals or of plants, or they're part and parcel of the narrative texture. So I'll refer you back to even a very old and somewhat corny and outdated animated film like Disney's Bambi from 1942 that does not have any human characters. I mean, the only role that the humans play in that film is that they shoot Bambi's mother and they burn the forest. But we don't see that. We just hear the animals talk about it. In more recent years, there's been a lot of experiments with telling stories from non-human viewpoints. So Ursula K. Le Guin, the American writer, has written stories that are told from the viewpoint of a lab rat, of a tree by the side of the road. The French novelist Bernard Werber has written also a story that has it's not the viewpoint of a tree, but the tree actually intentionally releases a leaf at a crucial moment in the story and solves a crime mystery, or helps the human inspector solve a crime mystery. He's also written a trilogy in which half of the protagonists are ants and half are human, and based on very, very deep research on ant perception, ant societies. So he really dove into the science to do this. The British writer Adrian Tchaikovsky and the American writer Sue Burke have both written novels where there are animals that are sentient and participate, or in Sue Burke's case, plants, a bamboo, an intelligent alien bamboo, that come to form part of the human community that settles on the planet. And they are very transparently, the trope of science fiction is a way of exploring these non-human perspectives. So those are some of the examples of writers that have precisely used the mode of non-realist fiction to present us the world from the viewpoint of non-human perspectives. Kim Stanley Robinson in Ministry for the Future has also attempted that. I mean, he has little passages that are told from the point of view of a photon, and one from the point of view of herds of animals, one is the point of view of the sun. It doesn't work very well in that novel, honestly, because I don't think Robinson is actually that interested in that. He is profoundly interested in human agency and what humans do with each other and with nature. But there are other authors that are deeply interested in that question. Also, the Canadian author Barbara Gowdy's The White Bone, which is only elephant characters. There are no human characters in that novel. So there are actually a lot of narrative experiments that try to use precisely fictional narrative to foreground those kinds of perception and agency and sociality.
And is that what you do at your institute?
So at the institute we do different things. So the institute as a whole the Institute of the Environment and Sustainability is a very interdisciplinary community of researchers that, where I'm actually an odd woman out in the sense that I'm often the only humanist in the room. I mean, they're mostly scientists and legal scholars and economists, so there's a broad spectrum of research that goes on. In the subunit that I direct, the Lab for Environmental Narrative Futures, for Environmental Narrative Strategies, we try to teach students and fellow faculty some of the tools of narrative analysis to produce narratives about environmental crises. So sometimes we do this in connection with other institutions. So, for example, last summer we hired 4 graduate students, 2 from film, one from English and one from urban planning, because we had been asked by the Los Angeles County Department of Parks and Recreation to help them create narratives about the importance of urban parks. So this was, of course, particularly obvious during the pandemic, but the Parks and Recreation Department was very worried that once the pandemic was over, they would once again be the first department whose budget would be cut, right? So they wanted to make the case that they wanted to tell better stories about why parks are important for people, they're important for property values, and they're also important as ecological habitat within cities. So that was one project. Another project that we did a few years ago was that we collaborated with a local television station. They had an environmental documentary series called Earth Focus, and we created sort of digital complements to that. So, for example, I directed a short documentary about a particular kind of parrot in Los Angeles that is endangered in its original habitat in Mexico, but has now found an excellent home in LA and is thriving. And so it poses interesting problems because it's both an endangered species but also a non-native species. So how do we think about that? And how do we think about biodiversity in the city? So we had a short documentary about them that's online, as well as 6 essays, some photo essays, some text essays that were written, some by graduate students, some by faculty, about issues of how we live with non-humans in the city, which is quintessentially human habitat, but is of course being co-inhabited by others with us. And then currently, one of the projects I should mention, although it's still very much underway, not nearly finished, is that we wanted to do a bit of science fiction of our own. We wanted to think about what Los Angeles would look like environmentally in 2050. And we wanted to make 3 short film episodes about that. Now, 20 minutes or so each. But making an hour of film is, we talked to film producers in Los Angeles, of which we have many, and they said, well, it's going to cost you about $1 million. It's not going to be too expensive. And we were like, oh my God, $1 million? We don't have that kind of money. And so one of our members, my colleague Danielle Snelson, who is he was co-appointed with Design and Media Arts, said, well, but we could use a video game as a basis. Many people do that. They use a video game and then they modify the video game and make short films that are called machinima, because it's sort of cinema based on the machine. And so you're not going to believe this, but what we chose was Grand Theft Auto 5, which is a horribly violent and pessimistic video game about drug dealing and shooting and car racing in the city. But it's set in the city, so the 5th installment of it, Grand Theft Auto 5, is set in the fictional city of Los Santos that is actually modeled on Los Angeles, and quite strikingly realist, actually, in a lot of the details. And so we're using that to develop a totally alternative vision of what the city is going to look like in 2050. So, and this has turned out to be much more of a technical challenge than we initially anticipated. But we're hoping that will really be different. We're sort of embracing the video game aesthetic, but also pushing back against that vision of the city and saying, no, Los Angeles actually could be something very different in the future than this, expanse of concrete where people commit crimes. So that's one of the current projects. So we do both fictional and documentary projects, along with then, inviting speakers, holding workshops on the various types of research that are going on among our members. I hope that gives some kind of idea.
Thank you. And just for your information, turning video games into movies is quintessential what Korea does very, very, very well. Yes, yes. So anyway, 지금 굉장히 인문학적인 성찰로 지금 하셨는데, 김 교수님께 한번 그 인문학 지금 제자분들께서 굉장히 관심을 많이 보이고 질문도 했는데, 김 교수님께서 보시기에는 인문학적인 성찰에서 지금 하이제 교수님이 하시는 프로젝트와 정말 현실에 굉장히 가깝고 현실의 임팩트가 굉장히 임팩트풀한 그런 거를 보시면서 어떤 생각을 하실까 궁금한데 김기훈께서 한번 말씀 좀 부탁드리겠습니다.
네, 감사합니다. 그러네요. 저희 학생들이 좋은 질문을 많이 해줬네요. 그래서 저도 이어서 말씀드리겠습니다. 사실 제가 이야기를 굉장히 좋아하고 또 내러티브 이론에 가진 관심으로 제가 철학 공부를 시작했기 때문에 선생님 강의를 굉장히 흥미롭게 들었습니다. 근데 제 질문이 아마 그 내러티브와 이제 이야기에 대한 질문들이 주로 될 것 같은데요. 제가 이제 그 선생님께 제일 동의했던 부분, 그것은 그 리얼리즘의 서사가 리얼리티를 깨끗하게 반영하는 것은 아니다. 그러니까 어떤 한 문화나 맥락에서 리얼리즘에 근거한 내러티브가 그 경계를 넘어가면 이제 더 이상 사실적인 힘을 발휘하지 못할 수 있다는 그 말씀 굉장히 동의했고, 그래서 지금 환경 글쓰기가 그 SF 서사 전략을 가지고 오는 것이 이제 단지 커뮤니케이션에 있어서의 그런 유리함뿐만 아니라 그 거리두기가 가지고 있는 그 서사 전략 그 부분을 이제 활용한다는 것에 대해서 정말 동의했고요. 그런데 이제 선생님 거기서 한 걸음 더 나아가셔서 그냥 거리두기라는 것 자체가 그렇다고 해서 어떤 현재에 대한 비판적 관점을 고스란히 그냥 담보해 주는 것은 아니기 때문에 그 SF 서사 전략을 가지고 온다 하더라도 그것을 판단할 수 있을 다른 근거들이 필요하다는 말씀을 하셨던 것 같아요. 그리고 이제 그걸 정의의 문제로 가지고 오셨던 것 같은데, 제가 이제 이렇게 이해하고 또 선생님의 주장이나 말씀에 이제 많이 동의하는 입장에서 제가 뭐 특별히 거기에 이제 어떤 비판적인 그런 게 아니라 선생님의 말씀을 조금 더 듣기 위한 질문을 한 2가지 정도 생각했습니다. 제 첫 번째 질문은 선생님께서 그러니까 표명하시지는 않지만 분명히 더 좋은 이야기가 있다. 그러니까 더 나은 이야기가, 더 바람직한 이야기가 있다고 생각하고 계신 것 같습니다. 저도 그렇게 생각하는데요. 어떤 이야기들은 더 좋고 또 반면 다른 이야기들은 더 위험할 수 있다. 이런 판단이 분명히 가능한데 우리가 이 판단을 어떤 기준을 가지고 할 수 있을 것인가와 관련된 질문을 처음으로 드리고 싶습니다. 그러니까 선생님 이제 처음에 그 레이첼 카슨 의 우화 얘기하셨었는데 그 우화와 그것에 반대하는 몬산토의 우화가 설령 같은 어떤 서사 전략을 가지고 있다 하더라도 그게 그냥 단지 서로 상대적인 두 이야기이지는 않을 거라고 생각하거든요. 근데 이제 그렇다면 우리가 더 좋은 서사를 생각해야 하고 더 바람직한 정의로운 환경의 미래를 위해서 더 좋은 이야기를 선택하고 그것을 퍼뜨리고 그것을 만들어가는 그런 입장에서 우리가 그럼 어떤 기준을 가질 것인가와 관련된 그 질문을 갖게 됩니다. 그래서 선생님이 그 말씀을 안 하신 게 아니고 그 정의의 문제로 말씀하셨고 또 선생님이 소개해 주신 그 오코라포르 그 소설이 저는 굉장히 흥미로웠는데 제가 읽어본 적은 없지만 꼭 읽어보고 싶은 이야기인데요. 거기서 이제 선생님이 어떤 그 대안적인 서사의 예를 충분히 보여주셨다고 생각합니다. 그런데 제가 그래서 그런 관점에서 제가 드리고 싶은 질문은 정의에 대한 관점이 내러티브 내부에 있는가? 그러니까 내러티브 자체 안에서 정의를 우리가 찾을 수 있는가? 아니면 그게 아니라면 그럼 우리가 더 좋은 이야기로 향해 가기 위해서 혹은 더 좋은 많은 이야기들을 만들기 위해서 이 정의에 대한 관점이나 관념을 어디서 가져가야 하는가? 이제 이 질문을 드리고 싶고요. 그런 의미에서 이제 선생님께서 제안하셨던 그 내러티브와 정의의 관계에 대한 그 이야기를 조금 더 들려주셨으면 좋겠습니다. 이게 저희 첫 번째 질문이고요. 두 번째 질문은 조금 다른 측면의 질문인데 이제 선생님이 윌리엄 깁슨이 했던 미래는 이미 와 있다. 균등하게 도달하지 않았을 뿐이다. 근데 이 이야기는 그릇된 거다. 그다음에 또 지금 우리의 시대의 사실주의는 SF다. 근데 그것도 적절하지 않다. 이렇게 말씀하셨을 때 제가 동의하는 바는 미래가 이미 와 있는데 균등하게 오지 않았다라고 말할 때 그 미래를 생각하는 거는 어떤 선적인 그런 시간관념 안에 있는 거라고 생각이 들고요. 그럼 도대체 이미 와 있는 미래는 어떤 거고 균등하게 도달하지 않은 미래는 어떤 것인가, 이제 이런 질문을 할 수 있을 거라는 생각이 들거든요. 근데 저는 사실 그 이야기가 다른 이야기가 아니라 우리의 현재가 균등하지 않다는 의미인 것 같습니다. 그러니까 우리가 현재라고 생각하고 지금이라고 생각하지만 지금 우리가 처해 있는 모든 상황이 이 세계 위에 있는 모든 존재자들에게 동일한 시간으로 체험되고 있지 않다. 이제 그런 의미에서 이 SF가 시간적인 미래를 생각해서 그 시간적인 미래의 관점에서 현재를 이제 통찰하게 하는 그런 어떤 통찰력을 주는 게 사실이지만 그것은 언제나 현재의 문제를 비판적으로 비판하기 위한 그런 통찰력이라고 생각이 들고요. 그런 의미에서 이제 선생님이 그 환경의 미래들, 그러니까 제목에서 썼던 그 환경의 미래들을 말씀하셨을 때 그 환경의 미래들은 어떤 가능한 미래들이었을 텐데, 저는 이 환경의 미래들을 고민해야 하는 우리의 관점이 선적인 시간 개념을 뛰어넘어야 하지 않는가, 그런 의미에서 미래가 아니라, 그러니까 유토피아적이든 디스토피아적이든 앞으로 다가올 어떤 세계가 이런 모습이니까 우리가 지금 어떻게 해야 된다, 이런 뜻이 아니라 우리가 지금 당장 해야 할 것이 무엇인가를 찾는 방식으로 미래를 생각해야 하는 게 아닌가라는 생각이 들거든요. 그러니까 어떤 관점이, 시간 관점이 그러니까 선적인 개념을 뛰어넘어야 하고, 또 다른 측면에서는 미래로 비추어서 현재를 생각하는 게 아니라 현재 우리가 무엇을 할 것인가를 선택하는 것으로 미래를 포함해야 되는 게 아닌가라는 생각이 드는데, 제가 이게 잘 설명이 되는지 모르겠는데요. 어쨌든 이런 저의 생각에 대해서 선생님은 어떻게 생각하시는지 궁금합니다. 네, 제 질문이 이 두 가지였습니다. 감사합니다.
Fascinating. I think we have some value judgments to consider. Also, I sort of take the second question as sort of a directional flow, whether it is from the future to the present or from the future to the present, from the present to the future. So the directional flow is sort of how you think about it, is sort of what I was thinking. What do you think?
Yes, thank you so much. These are really, again, really challenging questions. So I'll do my best without hoping that I can resolve everything. So my argument or my research for this piece started with two observations that were not about what is a better story or a worse story. They simply started with the observation that most environmental science fiction stories right now are shaped by dystopian or apocalyptic or disaster vision. So the overwhelming majority of them are inscribed in a genre that by definition presents a worse future, whatever that is, right? Very few, very few, dare to go in the opposite direction toward something utopian. Again, also a genre that is defined or was defined in the past by presenting an ideal society in the author's view, and in more recent versions sort of at least presenting a better society. So there's a certain genre prejudging of this that comes with these subgenres of literature. But that's not where I started. It was just the observation that most of these novels, like Nathaniel Rich's Odds Against Tomorrow, or a lot of the Scandinavian and German films and novels about environmental futures, are visions of hell. I mean, where, you know, all civic institutions from government to healthcare to justice to education have broken down, and people simply are killing each other, even eating each other. I mean, cannibalism is a favorite motif in a lot of these visions of the future. And I was wondering why that is. Why are so few people capable or willing to imagine a better futures or mixed futures? Yeah. Even granting that, of course, the purpose of apocalyptic stories often is to prevent the future that they describe. But that's where I would agree with Professor Park, that apocalypse, which was once a very powerful metaphor in environmentalism, has become such a staple commodity that, you know, I was mentioning this in the workshop yesterday. I mean, these days we watch apocalyptic movies with a beer in one hand and a snack in the other, right? I mean, we're not really scared by apocalypse in film that much anymore. So I think it has lost that critical function that it once had. The other observation was this odd migration out of science fiction motifs, themes, and narrative strategies from the genre itself into journalism, into popular science. I thought, what is that all about? That is very strange, that actually people who want to convey the science to the public, who want to incentivize people to activism, why are they using science fiction motifs? So those were just, that's sort of what prompted it, and that was not, in my mind, I wasn't thinking of that as a better or worse story. I was just curious why that was. But then when I started looking at these strategies and what they were trying to deal with in a lot of cases, and how climate communication has shifted over the last 10 or 15 years, it was clear that some of these experiments were driven by a desire to push against species narratives, like the Anthropocene, the big we humans are altering the planet, we humans are causing climate change, where, you know, especially, of course, you know, activists on the political left were saying, well, wait a minute, no, this is actually not how climate change works. Most of the greenhouse gas emissions are produced by a small minority of humankind, whereas a large majority that has contributed nothing or very little is suffering the gravest consequences. So that's where environmental justice comes in. And in 2015, for example, the science fiction writer Paolo Bacigalupi wrote a novel called The Water Knife, that is set in a drought-stricken American Southwest, so it plays in Arizona, Nevada, and Texas. And it was hailed as a new kind of climate novel because it really emphasized climate refugees. And one thing that Bacigalupi does is, in this case, the climate refugees come to Nevada and Arizona, not from the global south, but from Texas. So what does that do to our ideas about justice? And when these people are not your expected, you know, people of color from the global south, what if they're white people from Texas that are refugees now? How does that change things, right? So it was hailed by academics as a really interesting experiment. I think it's a much more problematic novel in reality, and does some really tricky things, and some of the empirical research on it confirms that there were some very interesting reactions, that even though people sympathized with the refugee characters in the novel, they would also say things like, some of them, not all of them, a minority, but a significant minority would say, well, I'm very glad that I don't live in Nevada or Arizona, because this shows what desperate things people will do when they're put in extreme circumstances, and I'm glad they're not here. So actually, the xenophobia and the racism was reinforced outside the novel in spite of the identification with the characters. I thought that was a fascinating empirical research result that I think we need to think about, that non-academic readers read differently, and different readers read the same stories very differently and derive very different motifs from them. So that's sort of what I'm interested in terms of thinking about what work fiction does, what work realism does, and what it doesn't do. And to me, it did seem to me in principle that having stories about our climate futures in particular that do not assume that grand we, the human species, is causing this, but that pinpoints where the real agency and the real culpability lies, that does in the Pleasant seem to me a more interesting story and a more productive story than acting or telling stories as if we were all equally responsible. So that to me would be one criterion, that it actually does not ignore social and economic inequality, differences in geopolitical power, in race, ethnicity, caste, class, gender, and so forth, that are structuring the real experience of climate change right now. So that to me would be one way of making that assessment of what might be a more productive story. But I'm saying this knowing that some of these stories that I thought were doing that work were not being read that way. So we always need to be, I mean, that's, I think, where more empirical research is really helpful in figuring this out. But you're asking a deeper question, and I'm not sure that I can answer that. You really ask, if I understood you correctly, which is like, so what does justice look like? And I think that's a question that I'm very glad that we're discussing in so much depth over the last 10 years without knowing exactly what the answer to that would look like. Because for any country, and Korea knows this, Koreans know this, just like indigenous peoples in a lot of the world know it, just like Filipinos, who have experienced American colonization know it, just as lots of Africa who've experienced British and French colonization know it. There is no way in which you can return to the status quo ante as your ideal of justice. I mean, there are certain historical processes that have done so much damage and have so irreversibly changed individuals as well as entire societies that there is no going back. So in that sense, maybe there can never be justice. I mean, Korea cannot go back to or cannot resume the history that it had before Japanese colonization. In that sense, there can never be justice, right? But there can be the acknowledgement that these things have taken place and that they create moral obligations and moral questions of moral consideration. So I think to the extent that those get translated into narrative, that to me would be a better narrative than one that deliberately tries to ignore that. I also wanted to mention here that we're speaking here about fiction, but I think for journalists and popular science writers, there is a somewhat different contract with the reader. And I think most journalists would say that, yes, of course, there are better and worse stories. And it doesn't mean that journalists, of course, have an opinion. They're not neutral. Or they can be objective, but not neutral. They can be objective in the sense that they deal responsibly with the facts such as they are known to them, by not leaving anything out, by not lying about them, as some media in the US do, and by presenting the facts as they are known. But that doesn't mean that you don't have an opinion. I mean, that sometimes gets confused, I think. So I think the contract there is, with the readers, is a little bit different, and there is an accountability to facts that to some extent filmmakers who are feature filmmakers, not documentary filmmakers who have the same contract, but feature filmmakers and novelists can get around. Then in Okorafor, I mean, one reason I like that novel, it's a flawed novel, Lagoon. I mean, I think it actually has a lot of problems, and one of the problems that it has is that it's quite unclear of how you actually achieve these momentous changes. That leaves me a bit unsatisfied. But I do think she is justice is one of the main themes in the novel, in the sense that it is an allegory of re-Africanizing Africa after colonization. I think that's the meaning of the sci-fi allegory there. So I think that's where the justice comes in. And then it also comes in through, and this goes to the question that was asked about non-human agency, through integrating the perspectives, and even the storytelling act is performed by a spider, which is a traditional figure in West African cosmologies. So there's also an eye to multi-species justice, and saying, what does this whole complex of justice problems look like when we include non-humans, who often have equally or even more borne the brunt of modernization and colonization, and so forth. Does that sort of answer the justice part of the question?
I think we could talk all night.
Yes, we could. I mean, I agree, and regarding the future, I'll just be very brief since I've talked too long. I mean, I agree with you that I would agree with partly with Gibson and Robinson, but I also kind of want to reclaim that we see futures, and I just don't think that the future is here. By definition, the future is not here. I'm ventriloquizing the German sociologist Niklas Luhmann here, who called one of his articles, "The future cannot arrive," because then it's no longer the future; it is the present. So, and I think it is really important to keep the future as a reservoir of political and social alternatives, because if we roll it too hastily into the present, as I think especially Robinson does in a certain sense, by saying, oh, this is just our realism, Well, I think he's selling his own science fiction and other science fiction a little short. I think it is also really important to at least try and offer blueprints of what other kinds of societies might look like, how our futures as we see them now could be different, and what mechanisms would take us there. And I mean, The Ministry for the Future is a bit of a flop as a novel. I don't think it reads very well. It's sort of a compendium of different solutions, from carbon capture to eco-terrorism to the carbon currency. And Robinson reads economics and science constantly. He's obsessed with that. So I'm not surprised that he's picked that up from other publications that you pointed to, Professor Park. But it is also about, really imagining things that in our normal social imagination we can't yet. And that's kind of what I'm trying to recuperate. That's why I'm pushing back again, a little bit against this idea that, this is just a realism now, the future is here. Well, no, the future is still out there. And I think part of what makes me despair as well as hope is the fact that right now we actually have a huge spectrum of futures, some of which, if we act in there are some positive signs in transformation of transportation. I mean, some of these futures don't look bad at all. They look actually pretty good. And then others look disastrously bad. And it's not possible to know right now what's going to happen. So I think, to me, it's actually not a question of linear projection at all. To me, the crucial sort of narrative structure of our time right now is the multiverse. Everything, everywhere, all at once, right? It's these different possibilities that all coexist. You see that structure cropping up everywhere right now, and I think it is because I think there is a sense, consciously or not, that we have a range of futures ahead of us that range from apocalypse to pretty good, and we don't know which one's going to happen, who's going to have which one. We're also not going to all have the same, right? So I think the multiverse, to me, is the parallel timelines is sort of the better. It's an interesting phenomenon right now, how many films and novels have that multiverse or parallel timeline structure. It's not new. It's been there before, but it is really, really being used a lot right now. And so I think it expresses some of that sense of, we don't have a linear sense of the future.
Thank you so much. 정말 오늘 밤새 얘기를 해도 정말 끝이지 않을 얘기 같은데, 저한테 일단은 그만하라는 저의 굉장히 강력한 일이라서 질문들이 많으실 거라고 상상되지만, 오늘은 여기까지 하고, 우리한테는 이런 질문들에 답을 계속 구해야 되는 그러한 의미가 있고, 또 읽어야 될 책들도 많아졌고, 봐야 될 영화도 많아졌고, 지금 그 하이제 교수님 말씀대로 정말 우리한테는 너무나 다양한 미래가 있지만, 저희가 좀 우리가 나가야 될 방향에 대해서 우리가 마음도 한번 다져야 되고, 우리 김옥길 총장님 말씀에 의하면 새 시대의 총명한 여자들이 뭉쳐서 최선을 다하면 안 될 일이 무엇이겠는가라고 말씀하셨는데, 우리 오늘도 한번 그 마음으로 우리의 미래를 우리가 한번 상상해보고 해나가는 그런 계기가 되었으면 좋겠습니다. 하이제 교수님 너무 감사드리고요. 김 교수님, 박 교수님 너무 감사드리고 모든 분들께 감사드리겠습니다. 좋은 하루가 되세요.